European Union has been very protectionist and Lula will act to reassess the agreement. According to the executive secretary of the Brazilian Chancellery, the new European demands are creating barriers and impossibilities for the agreement to be finally ratified, and that Lula intends, in conversation with European leaders, to mark a path for revising the pact. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva landed in Europe today with an agenda to be fulfilled in Italy and France, on a trip that marks his third visit to European territory since the beginning of the government. The representative's commitments will include meetings with the Italian sociologist Domenico de Masi, with Pope Francis at the Vatican, and bilateral meetings with the Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, and with the mayor of Rome, Roberto Gualtieri. Afterwards, Lula will travel to France on Thursday, where, among other commitments, he will give a speech at a festival in the capital Paris and meet with President Emmanuel Macron, according to GON. Going to two of the main countries of the European Union at this moment denotes an important movement for the trip, since the free trade agreement between the European bloc and Mercosur is a priority on the agenda of both blocs, so that it finally gets off the ground. In recent days, the different provisions of the two parties on different topics of the pact have been widely aired. Despite being closed in 2019, the text has not been ratified. The Europeans made new demands that the South American countries did not see as fair, since many are unilateral. For the Deputy Executive Secretary of the General Secretariat of the Presidency of the Republic, Tânia Maria de Oliveira, interviewed by Sputnik, Lula during the trip can establish a dialogue that allows the agreement between the European Union, Mercosur, not to happen to the detriment of the interests of the country's South Americans. The European Union has been very protectionist. President Lula is going to intercede to reassess the agreement, stated Oliveira. The executive secretary also highlighted that the document with the new European demands is extremely hard and difficult, creating a series of barriers and impossibilities and including reprisals and sanctions against Mercosur countries. The new demands of the European Union can bring innumerable damages, including commitments with the Paris Agreement, for example, which Brazil must respect and fulfill. The agreement has clauses that will increase deforestation by reducing the tax for the export of products agriculture, which are the main drivers of deforestation in Mercosur countries, he added. In the view of the Brazilian Chancellery, the meeting between Lula and Macron could mark the path for revising the agreement. During her visit to Brasilia last week, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, stated that Europe and Brazil were beginning a new era and was very willing to ratify the agreement between the blocs. However, the Brazilian government has moved with caution on the subject when it is notorious that there are disagreements between the countries. While Brasilia would like to revise the part of the agreement to restrict the country's possibility of opening up to government purchases, the Europeans want to rediscuss environmental issues. Ida Moratti is working on a response to the European Union, and the text should bring Brazilian disagreement with the new environmental requirements and the assessment that, if sanctions are applied, they should apply to both sides and not just to the South countries. Americans. Just yesterday, Lula said that the European Union cannot threaten Mercosur to ratify the agreement and that he would discuss with Macron the question of approval by the French Parliament of the hardening of the agreement, as reported. The European Union cannot threaten Mercosur. We are strategic partners, stated the leader. Lula also declined the invitation made by the European bloc to participate in a summit between the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, and the European Union scheduled for next month in Brussels. The president's decision is causing European leaders to articulate behind the scenes to try to convince him to go, since his absence would reduce the prestige of the summit, since Brazil is the main Latin American country, and could even encourage other regional leaders not to travel to Brussels. The media also points out that, regarding the agreement within the government, the environment to finalize it later this year is not good. The Ministry of Management, the Ministry of Agrarian Development and Family Agriculture, the Ministry of Health, and the Executive Secretariat of the Civil House tend to take a position contrary to the agreement under the terms in which it was signed 4 years ago. The Ministries of Agriculture and Livestock, Development, Industry, Commerce, and Services, and the Ministry of Planning and Budget are favorable. One more news. Lula goes back and decides to meet Italy's right-wing premier, Giorgia Meloni. The president was advised by the auxiliaries to meet with the Italian leader. At the same time, the Brazilian's advisory team worked for Meloni to accept the hearing. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's agenda has been with appointments scheduled for Italy for a long time, however. From the beginning, it was announced that Lula would not meet with the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. Scheduling problems. However, now at the last minute, the president decided to meet the Prime Minister, according to the Valor Economico newspaper. The meeting with the ultra-right leader takes place tomorrow afternoon. Before, Lula's official trip only included political meetings with the Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, the mayor of Rome, Roberto Gualtieri, and Pope Francisco. Meloni took office as prime minister in October 2022. She leads the first far-right government in Italy since the end of World War II, in addition to being the first woman to hold the post. According to the media, there was fear among interlocutors from the Brazilian and Italian governments that the absence of a meeting with Meloni could foster the image that ideological differences between the two leaders would be an obstacle to high-level dialogue between states. Still in Italy, in addition to the authorities, Lula had a meeting with sociologist Domenico De Masi. According to the Itamarati, the Brazilian representative and President Mattarella will address issues such as cooperation in the area of defense, especially in technology transfer, and the free trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur. The Italian will also offer lunch to Lula and the First Lady, Rosângela da Silva. One more news. China and Cuba discuss setting up military training center on the island. China and Cuba are in talks to establish a joint military training center on the island, raising concerns in Washington about the possible deployment of Chinese military forces close to US borders, reports the Wall Street Journal. According to the newspaper's sources, the United States fears that the creation of a new training center in Cuba could lead to the stationing of Chinese military forces and other security and intelligence operations just 160 kilometers off the coast of Florida. Discussions for installation on the north coast of Cuba are at an advanced stage, but have not yet been concluded, reports the Wall Street Journal. According to the newspaper, the administration of US President Joe Biden contacted Cuban authorities in an attempt to prevent the conclusion of the agreement. The White House declined to comment on this information to the newspaper. Previously, reports emerged that Havana and Beijing are already sharing 4 listening stations in Cuba. The Wall Street Journal reports that several intelligence officials report that Beijing sees its actions in Cuba as a geographical response to US relations with Taiwan. The heightened anxiety in Washington over China's ambitions in the Caribbean and Latin America comes as the administration is trying to de-escalate broader tensions with Beijing that have been fueled by a range of other issues, including support from the United States to Taiwan. The article notes, the United States was monitoring a planned visit by a senior Cuban Defense Ministry official to Beijing. The U.S. authorities interpreted the trip as another step in the negotiations over the training center. US media sources have previously reported that China is allegedly using a military base in Cuba to gather intelligence about the United States starting in 2019. On June 9, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Cuba denied information about an agreement with China for the construction of a military base destined to spy on the United States. Earlier, the coordinator of strategic communications at the U.S. National Security Council, John Kirby, said that his country was aware of reports of an alleged agreement between China and Cuba to establish a Chinese spy base on the island, but said that are false. One more news. Stoltenberg urges NATO members to invest more in collective air defense systems. North Atlantic Treaty Organization Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called for more investment in collective air defense systems, noting that the Ukrainian conflict showed how important it is to have modern multi-level defense systems. It is very important for NATO countries to invest in various means, but it is necessary to guarantee compatibility between the countries of the Atlantic Alliance. We must defend our airspace together, said Stoltenberg. According to him, the creation of air defense systems must build barriers between the nations of the alliance. Earlier, Stoltenberg, after the meeting in Brussels, said that the minister also agreed on a new rotational model for air and missile defense of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. According to him, this will ensure the efficient use of NATO resources in transition from air patrols to complex air defense. On Sunday, Stoltenberg spoke out against freezing the Ukrainian conflict, as well as its conclusion on Russia's terms. According to him, NATO will continue to support Ukraine. Senior officials and officials in Western countries have repeatedly found low inventories and production levels, impeding further support for Kiev. In turn, Russia sent a note to the countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov noted that any cargo containing weapons for Ukraine will become a legitimate target for Russia.